Hi, it's Dwyer, Dwyercrime.blog, also keepingitfree.blogspot.com. Today is July the 15th, 2022. Let's talk about the D.B. Cooper case. I just saw, and I haven't written any notes, I just watched a hot show on Netflix about D.B. Cooper. And they go through some of the suspects, and some of the researchers who are very well known in the D.B. Cooper community are on camera talking about their findings. Let's do that together here. It's going to be a short video. I have a prior D.B. Cooper video up. I encourage people to look at that. Here we're really going to dispel some ideas that some people have, in my opinion. But first, remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, in an earlier video, I made a point, which was that the media got D.B. Cooper's name wrong. And that mistake has huge consequences, because what we're really trying to do in figuring out who this perpetrator was is we're trying to figure out his outlook, what he was like in accomplishing what he did. So let me just point out, if I were to hijack a plane, and if I called myself J.B. Bond, right, that would show a different personality type, in my opinion, right? And I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, right? I'm just an everyday person. But the person who calls themselves J.B. Bond, to me, is a different personality type entirely than the person who uses the name James Bond, who adopts as his fictitious name the name of a well-known fictional character. Understand, the passenger wasn't D.B. Cooper. The passenger identified themselves as Dan Cooper. As I've argued here online in an earlier video, Dan Cooper is actually a very popular Canadian-French cartoon figure who was a fighter pilot who would, when needed, jump out of planes. Right? So just understand, if I call myself J.B. Bond, then it's cat and mouse. Then I might want to take credit for the hijacking. Right? The hijacking might actually be a personal mission, where over time I might want to infuriate and engage investigators who are looking at the way I did it and are trying to figure out if I'm the guy. But if I call myself James Bond, or not D.B. Cooper, but Dan Cooper, I believe that's a different person. That's the person who wants to be anonymous. So, in the Netflix piece, they focus on a guy named Rackstraw. And Rackstraw is a guy who loves the attention. Right? He's a guy who, when they ask him, hey, are you D.B. Cooper? One time he said, I couldn't be. I'm afraid of heights. Even though the guy, of course, had a military history that involved, parachuting. Right? Even though the guy was involved in flying planes in the military. Right here you have a cagey guy who is so secretive that they have his ex-wife from the 1970s on the show. And she talks about how she didn't really know about the guy's business dealings. She never asked the guy how much money he made. She apparently decided to leave him when she found out in the mid-70s he was applying for business loans and forging her name on the loan documents. Right? The guy would go places. He would have a briefcase. She couldn't ask the guy what was in the briefcase. So, of course, one day she saw the briefcase open. She opens up the briefcase, and the briefcase has a toupee and a fake mustache, even though the guy, of course, had a legitimate mustache in real life. Right? She pointed out that the guy would leave. The guy would be gone. When the guy would come back, he'd be clean shaven. She wouldn't know where the guy went. That marriage lasted 2 years. Right? 2 years. Then she was gone. Now, my reading, again, without any professional background whatsoever, my reading on D.B. Cooper is very different. Right? First, understand, the Rackstraw guy, and I understand there's a lot of evidence that a lot of people are attracted to. The Rackstraw guy would have been in his late 20s at the time of the hijacking. Right? The crew who interfaced with D.B. Cooper, the actual guy, Dan Cooper, right, put his age in his 40s. They thought he's an older guy. Now understand, he's on the plane. He's not some young kid who's making a big move and who is bossing people around. No, this is an older guy. This is a guy who's reassured enough to be smoking cigarettes and drinking hard liquor. Right? He, gives the stewardess a note. And included in the note is the request that the stewardess come and sit by him. Right, folks? This is a completely different personality type than the Daredevil who they're fixated on the Netflix show. Right? Let the evidence fall where it may. But I believe you're dealing with a person in a different position in life here. Right? Keep in mind, too, if I'm into James Bond, right? Let's say, the Dan Cooper figure is a James Bond type figure. Right? The reason I'm using James Bond here as an example, as an analogy, is because more people know of the James Bond character than the Dan Cooper character. But understand, if I use a name like James Bond, well, then I'm into the entire James Bond storyline. And it's a social one, isn't it? Right? James Bond has a higher purpose, folks. Right? He's serving on Her Majesty's Secret Service. He's trying to protect country. In his case, England. In Dan Cooper's case, Canada. Right? Understand, too, James Bond has people around him who are close to him. Right? There's M, there's Q, there's Moneypenny. Right? He's getting assignments, and then he has to meet people he doesn't know and interface with them. Might have romantic liaisons, might develop romantic liaisons. He's social. Right? He's not who this Rackstraw character is, where his wife is looking at him. They can't talk about how much money he's making. The guy comes across as antisocial. The people around him are being used, right? His wife is being used for a business loan she doesn't know about. The Rackstraw character strikes me as antisocial. the very opposite of someone who would use the Dan Cooper moniker. Right? Make no mistake, the guy on the plane is social. Right? It's a short ride. The guy is smoking a lot of cigarettes. Most of the people on the plane have no idea that the plane is being hijacked. The guy is that Teflon. Right? This isn't the young guy again who's sweating and struggling. No, this is an older soul who's cool, calm, and collected, using the moniker of a popular James Bond type figure. Right? Able to talk in a calm manner, polite manner, according to reports. Able to talk with the stewardess. Keep in mind, the content is as heavy as possible. At one point, the stewardess is sitting next to him, and the guy says, look, I could blow us all up. If I have this touch that, we're all gone. But he's able to do so in a way where, again, the people around don't know. Right? He's just another guy on a plane having hard liquor and smoking cigarettes. Right? So forgive me. I've researched a lot of these supposed deathbed confession type people who say, hey, I'm D.B. Cooper. Right? I've heard of people like this Rackstraw character. He's one of the more popular suspects, where they go through his background and say, hey, he was in the military. Hey, he was around planes. He parachuted. Right? And of course, we're just supposed to conveniently overlook the more than decade age difference. Right? I'm supposed to believe that this guy who's awkward to even his wife is somehow fluid on the plane. Right? I have a hard time with it. I just believe the personality here doesn't ring true. I believe what would is someone who is into comic books, but is older, has read Dan Cooper books for a long time, fully identifies with the character, is socially conversant. On the show, they point out that the Canadian military suffered a lot of budgetary cutbacks in the 1960s. So by the time you get to the 1970s, you have a lot of people with military skills who were being phased out. Right? The theory is that a Canadian may have decided, okay, it's time for me to make sure I'm secure for my retirement. Right? His background would be with the good guys. Right? I don't think bad guys would think about using Dan Cooper's name as their passenger name. Right? I believe that the actual hijacker is someone who completely identified with Dan Cooper, who understood hijacking protocol. Right? This person understands, completely understands, that he doesn't want hostages. Right? He lets all of them go. Right? When the plane lands, he lets all of them go. He makes it clear to the stewardess that he's just in it for the money, basically. There's no insecurity where the guy's on a plane and he needs to let everyone know that he's the person in control. There's none of that. Now, this is an older person who knows planes, who isn't thrown by the fact that, this is a hijacking. The person is clearly researched hijacking. He knows he's just in it for the money. On his tie, there are a lot of metallic substances, including titanium, which someone would only get on their tie, assuming that the tie is not a plant by him. Right? We're to believe that he's about to jump out the back after everyone's off the plane and the plane's in flight. Right? We're supposed to believe he's about to jump off the back, and he decides he's going to take off his tie and leave the tie on the plane, right? Not just take off the tie and drop it into the ether, right? Because he's on the back steps now of the plane. Now, assuming that the tie is actually his tie and not a plant that he wanted to leave behind to throw off law enforcement, understand that titanium would necessarily have gotten on the tie if he were someone who repaired planes or someone who worked around heavy military equipment. That's who the person is. It's not someone in their 20s who has just been unfavorably discharged by the U.S. Army, who nobody recalls having any kind of affinity toward Dan Cooper comics, who at 28 then decides, fresh out of the military, that as a civilian, he's going to hijack this plane. Right? I just don't see that happening. Right? Let's talk about some other angles here too. If the person is Canadian, right, the question arises, well, why would he hijack a plane in the United States and, of course, jump out of the plane over U.S. territory, right? I need for people to understand that there is much about this case we simply don't know. When he jumps out the plane, are you certain that there isn't a group somewhere on the floor that's going to pick him up and help him get to safety? Right? Are you positive? Because, of course, him jumping out of the plane is a big surprise. Right? He picks the route that the plane takes out of Seattle. Right? After the other passengers have gotten off the plane. Right? He doesn't tell them where he's going to jump out of the plane. You get the feeling this guy has been military. He understands approximately where the plane is going to be. He has thought out this crime to the point where he has a letter he's going to give. It's already prepared to the stewardess. Right? Are you positive he doesn't have buddies? If he's military, he might have some military buddies who are there waiting for him on the ground. Right? It's a stormy day, it's raining, it's a high travel day, one of the highest travel days of the year. Right? Are you sure this isn't all planned? So he jumps out of the plane and people pick him up. Let's talk about the money that's found. Are you sure that his bag breaks apart and that $5,800 magically drop where the family years later finds the tattered bills? Isn't it also likely that this guy goes back to the scene? Folks, we don't know what the guy looks like today, right? We don't know who he is today. Isn't it possible that this guy could have gone back to the scene later, or perhaps with the crew that picks him up on the ground, right? Because nothing's found, right? His parachute and all that stuff, that's not found ever, right? Are you sure that the team that picks him up on the ground, and I'm speculating here, but we have no information to suggest otherwise, didn't decide, hey, you know what? Let's sprinkle $5,800 over here, or maybe $7,000, where later they find $5,800, to give the illusion that I may have perished jumping out of the plane, right? If the cops believe I'm dead, then I'm free and clear. But what I think I know is that someone calling themselves Dan Cooper did not want to be found, did not want to be questioned by the police later. They're not going to engage in some cat and mouse game with the police where they refuse to say, I'm not D.B. Cooper, in interviews with reporters or law enforcement investigators. I believe if you're calling yourself James Bond or Dan Cooper, you're not giving a deathbed confession. You've picked an anonymous name so you can be anonymous. You're not even trying to be hip or clever. Right, so